Now we're going to talk about the third and ultimately the victorious of the three kingdoms, the Silla kingdom that was located in the southeastern portion of the Korean peninsula. Silla was the smallest of the three kingdoms. It had the lowest population, it had the weakest economy, and the weakest military. Goguryeo had a great cavalry arm, large mountain fortresses, effective generals, and the most territory by far, also the highest population. Baekje had the most robust economy, the best trade, the strongest navy, the greatest artistic, cultural output. So how did Silla overcome Goguryeo and Baekje? Well, unlike the other two kingdoms, Silla was the best led. It had the best leadership throughout the entire 7th century, which resulted in Silla unifying the entire Korean peninsula. And it really is to the leaders that the credit for their success is due. If you look at this image here, on the bottom left, there is a statue of one of the greatest Korean generals in history, and perhaps the greatest of this time period, Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung helped to defeat Baekje and Goguryeo for the kingdom of Silla, but also protected the country against a Chinese invasion that would come after unification. Kim Il-sung had originally, as a middle-aged man, he was the great general, but he had originally been a youth, like the young man pictured on the right, on horseback, engaged in horseback archery. These young men were called Hwarang warriors, which literally meant flowering youth warriors. So young men, even as little boys, would enter the service of Buddhist monasteries. They would be taught Buddhist religious teaching about compassion, the Eightfold Path, if you recall from our previous lecture. They would be taught Confucian virtues in terms of their social ties and morality and how to treat other people and their place in society. And they would also be taught many different martial arts, swordsmanship, wielding spears, horseback riding, archery, horseback archery, and including hand-to-hand fighting that would form the basis of the system of Taekwondo that would be developed much, much later on in Korean history and in modern times, the origins of Taekwondo resting with them. So you have this order of young warrior poets in Silla who follow a very strict code of morality, who attempt to defend the weak, who are seen as heroic, chivalric fighters, who will defend their kingdom despite the great disadvantages that they face. And these Hwarang warriors were the best military asset that the kingdom of Silla had. In fact, Kim Il-sung, when he becomes a great general, he really owes his excellence as a general to the training that he undertook as a Hwarang warrior in his youth. So I mentioned that Silla had exceptionally capable leaders. Just like with the other kingdoms, and just like with the ancient kingdom of Gojoseon, Silla had its mythic ruler, King Pak. Now, King Pak, again, is the same kind of situation with Donggun, right, where we don't know, and Jumon, we don't know if he was an historical figure or not, but the ancient scribes all treated him as real. King Pak supposedly was hatched from a tortoise egg. Right? And remember the tortoise, if you recall in the last video, the tortoise was a symbol of longevity, wisdom, and good fortune. Right? So, you have this fantastic story of the king born from an egg. It kind of hits close to home for me because my 3-year-old insisted that he wasn't born from his mother, that he actually hatched from a Tyrannosaurus Rex egg. So, but he was adamant about it, right? So maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some past connection or something. I don't know. That's from an image I made from a video about him being born from an egg. But I digress. We don't have specific evidence that King Pak ever existed historically. However, there is a great amount of evidence that Queen Sunduk of Silla not only existed, but was one of the most influential leaders in the 7th century, really in the context of the entire world. She was absolutely successful at virtually every venture she attempted. One thing that she did is, after having been educated in the traditional Chinese classics, she applied the principles behind the rule of Wan and Jing. If you recall, in the Han Dynasty, Wan and Jing were great emperors who radically slashed taxes. And when they radically slashed taxes, the ordinary people had more of their own wealth to put back into their farms, and this caused a massive amount of economic growth in Silla. On top of this, it earned her the support and admiration of the people. She used the surplus that eventually developed in her kingdom to not only build up her military, but to spread Buddhist temples and monasteries throughout the kingdom to provide people with a common ideological, spiritual, cultural framework. So Buddhism was a unifying force that brought the various tribes of Silla together under one banner, and she patronized monks and nuns heavily. Queen Sunduk is one of the most celebrated rulers in Korean history for a number of reasons. First of all, as stated earlier, she strengthened the economy and promoted the Buddhist culture within her domain. Secondly, she secured for Silla the alliance with Dong China, the emerging Dong dynasty in China, that would allow her successors to overtake the entire peninsula. And she did this despite the fact that all of the odds were stacked against her. The Dong Emperor, Dong Daizhu, was extraordinarily powerful. He was the most powerful man in the world in that century, and he did not respect her. He could not bring himself to respect a female ruler, and he even offered to have one of his generals come and marry her and rule the country for her to relieve her of the burden, because he believed she was not capable. What she ended up doing is she very diplomatically placated the emperor's kind of ego and encouraged him to cement his ties with her kingdom. And they ended up establishing an alliance that wouldn't bear fruit during her reign, partially due to the fact that Dong Daizhu didn't look at her as a worthy ally. But he signed the agreement, and later on the Dong will be instrumental in Shilla's overtaking of Bakje and Goguryeo. Sunduk also built up Shilla's military. Instead of relying on the traditional caste system that existed in Silla, which was called the bone rank system, in which it's kind of like how in European societies people will talk about royal blood. Right? The closer you are to royal blood, the more noble your house is, right? The more aristocratic you are. Well, in Silla, it wasn't blood that was considered precious or a sign of royalty, but bone. Right? The royal family literally had royal bones. In fact, they had the rank of sacred bone. Below them, you had the rank of true bone, and these were the great aristocratic families who could serve as ministers. And then you had other ranks as you descended the hierarchy down to common bone, right, which is an ordinary peasant. So your rank in the bone rank system determined a lot about how your life would turn out. It determined the limits to the size of your house, the size of your carriage. It determined the color of clothing that you could wear. It determined who you were going to marry. It determined the size of your burial. It determined what you could even what you could eat, what you couldn't eat. So there were all these sumptuary laws in place to build up this caste system. Well, Queen Sunduk decided that she wanted to try to avoid relying on the true bones so much, right? These great noble houses, because many of them did not respect the fact that they had a female ruler. Many of them were not willing to kind of follow her lead. So instead, she turned to the Hwarang warriors. I mentioned them earlier, this collective of youthful these young men who had been trained from boyhood as great fighters, trained in archery, horseback riding, swordsmanship, wielding the spear, the lance, right? The axe, mace. And they were also taught poetry, Buddhist morality, Confucian ethics. So they were very intellectually, artistically refined in addition to being great warriors. Well, she cultivated their support, and eventually they become her enforcers. Their loyalty is solely to the queen, not to their social class or to their bone rank, right? So she's able to build up a unified, loyal military entirely under her own command due to the fact that she's employing these great warriors. One aspect of these warriors is just like with Chinese society, ancient medieval Korean society viewed your outward appearance as a sign of your inner excellence, right? So if you were a moral person, if you were a good person, you're going to be physically beautiful. The more noble you are inside, the more noble you will be outside. And while in some societies that might be seen as superficial, it's very similar in some respects to the ancient Greeks, where physical beauty was a sign of inner purity. So the Hwarang warriors gained a reputation for being very handsome young men who were very dashing and valiant. And of course, they had a very stringent moral code that they followed, which included service to the queen. So they gained a reputation as these kind of gallant, valiant, sort of knight errants. And of course, modern Korean culture celebrates these young men. There have been countless dramas created, historical dramas at this point, celebrating the Hwarang warriors, their skill in battle, as well as other aspects of their image. But they played a major role in Shilla's defeat of Baekje and Goguryeo. And as I believe I mentioned earlier, but if I didn't, I'll just make sure to mention it now, the Hwarang warriors, their martial arts techniques, their hand-to-hand combat techniques would form the basis of what would later be developed as modern Taekwondo, if you've heard of that Korean martial art. Under Queen Sundok, Silla began to resemble Baekje in terms of its proponents of Buddhism. You can see here the Satgaram Grotto, a great, beautiful temple erected during the reign of the queen. And we can see in the bottom left corner a brilliant mural that was also created at the same time. The queen didn't promote Buddhism solely for its spiritual benefits. Buddhism created a common culture that the diverse tribes could rally around, and it promoted unity among them. Having this common Buddhist culture centered around monasteries, the monasteries were educational institutions that taught reading and writing, arithmetic, so the population and the economy benefited from the creation of these buildings. The queen also had constructed the Cheomsegundai Observatory, or the Tower of the Moon and Stars. This observatory was not just there for the prestige of the building, but it was there to guide the rituals that were performed at court in order to appease heaven, and also to assist farmers in knowing what time of the season to plant, to harvest, etc. In fact, like most pre-modern civilizations, in Silla, astronomy and agriculture were intimately linked. So the queen remained an outsized figure throughout her entire life. A number of legends kind of developed around her character. For example, there was a story in which a magician presented her with a painting of flowers, and he asked her if she could figure out how the flowers smelled just by looking at the painting. And people thought, well, it's impossible to know what what the flowers smell like just from looking at them. And she said, well, the painting's in spring, and there are no bees around the flowers, so they must not give off any scent at all. And of course, that was the right answer. So people kind of marveled at her great intellect. The most effective thing that she did, though, was maintaining the alliance with Dong China, because it would be Dong China that her descendants would be able to use to overturn the Three Kingdoms' political structure on the Korean Peninsula after her death. The queen was succeeded by another queen, Jin-duk, who reigned for only 7 years, but she very importantly continued to cultivate the alliance with Dong China. And Queen Jin-duk was ultimately succeeded by King Mu-yeol, and he would be the great king who really brought the Three Kingdoms period to an end. He relied on a great general, Kim Yu-shin, whom he used to first destroy the kingdom of Baekje and later the kingdom of Goguryeo. Now, really and truthfully, it was the Dong army that did the brunt of the fighting in the destruction of both kingdoms. The Silla invaded from the west. The Dong engaged in an amphibious landing on the territory of Baekje in order to bring it to heel. The Silla army was about 50,000. The Dong expeditionary force was about 150,000 men. And of course, this is in the 7th century, so this is an astronomical number of troops by world standards. But obviously, the Dong had superior forces. And so they were able to bring the alliance between King Mu-yeol and the Dong Emperor. They were able to effectively destroy the other two kingdoms, unifying them under Silla. In fact, the Dong Crown Prince, Li Zhi, was a great personal friend of King Mu-yeol, and the two of them effectively created a new era in Korean history. Of course, this new era would not be possible without Kim Yu-shin. I keep wanting to say Kim Yu-shin. I keep pronouncing it as if they were Chinese names, Romanized. They're Korean names, pronounced differently. In fact, Korean and Mandarin Chinese have no relation whatsoever, and both those languages have no relation to Japanese. Right? These are completely unrelated languages. So, it's very difficult to, we're having to deal with multiple languages here. So I ask your forbearance there. But Kim Yu-shin lived from 595 to 673, and he was one of the dominant influences on 4 different monarchs of Silla. In fact, going all the way back to Queen Seung-duk, when her high-ranking official, Bidam, decided to rebel against her, claiming that a woman had no authority to rule, he raised a very powerful army and very nearly defeated her, but he was defeated by Kim Yu-shin. Kim Yu-shin played a masterful psychological trick on Bidam that was very creative. Bidam believed that it was his destiny to overthrow the queen because he had seen what he believed was a falling star. And because of Kim Yu-shin's masterful use of spies, he uncovered where that star was supposed to have been in the sky, and he had a flaming kite thrown up into the sky to make it look like the star had returned to its location. And this caused Bidam to have a psychological breakdown. And of course, Kim Yu-shin was then able to rout his army, securing the reign for the queen. But Kim Yu-shin was also the architect of the invasion of Baekje and Goguryeo. And even before the final defeat of Goguryeo, he began to make moves to limit the Dong dynasty's influence over Silla. The Dong, because they did the bulk of the fighting, as they destroyed Goguryeo, they began to install governors and accept the homage of local rulers, and they started to call King Mu-yeol, instead of calling him a king, they began to call him a governor, make very subtle kind of, and not so subtle, digs at Shilla's sovereignty. And Kim Yushin encouraged the king to respond very violently against that and to push back thoroughly against this kind of encroachment. And he also made sure that the military was ready in the event that they had to throw the Tang dynasty out of northern Korea, which they end up having to do. So he is a very, very influential statesman, and the creation of a truly independent Korea, unified Korea, is as much his doing as King Muyul's. So Muyul did the brunt of the work in destroying Baekje and Goguryeo. It would be under his son Mumu that the last Goguryeo resistance would finally be destroyed, and we would have officially a fully unified Korean peninsula. But unfortunately, that did not mean peace. The new Dong Emperor, Gaozong, was not about to roll over and allow Silla to rule the peninsula without paying him the homage he believed that he was due. After all, the Dong armies had dominated the battlefield during the wars of unification. So Gaozong thought that the king of Silla should give the Dong Empire its due. King Munmu resented the fact that the Dong Emperor was attempting to to dominate him, to casually refer to him as a governor instead of a king. So the general, Kim Yushin, was dispatched to drive the Dong dynasty out of the Korean peninsula. And the Koreans were successful in driving out the Dong garrisons, despite the fact that they were outnumbered. They had the support of the local population in the north. The war actually helped to unify the Korean people culturally, because the common enemy, these outsiders from China, King Munmu could rally the former patriots from Goguryeo, from Baekje, and from Silla, and create a unified identity, a Korean identity that could oppose Chinese infiltration of their borders. On top of this, the Korean Navy was very effective at wrecking any attempt by the Dong to attack via the ocean. And what this meant was that the Dong could not resupply their troops by sea. This is something that will affect events on the Korean Peninsula many times in the future. For example, in the Imjin War, when Japan invaded Korea, the Japanese samurai were ultimately forced to withdraw because the Korean Navy was sinking their resupply ships. So this pattern that's being laid down here of Korean people coming together to drive out a foreign power and using their naval expertise to destroy the enemy's logistics is something that will be repeated throughout the next 1,000 years. Okay, so we're seeing a new golden age of a truly unified Korean peninsula emerging by the end of the 7th century. And that's where we'll pick up in the future.